Welcome to Straight to the Point. I'm your host, Representative Joe D'Orsi. In a world of long-windedness, I'm here to deliver you the capital news in 10 minutes or less. So, let's get straight to the point. So this is the Straight to the Point podcast. I'm Representative Joe D'Orsi, and in studio today I am joined by House District 62's own Jim Struzzi. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely, Joe. Thanks for having me.
And the 62nd, tell me a bit about it. That's Indiana County.
Yeah, solely Indiana County. Most of your population centers. I have Indiana University of Pennsylvania in my district, an independent hospital and Indiana Regional Medical Center. Some major banks are headquartered in Indiana County, as well as some major manufacturers. We still have a large gas industry, very much coal as well.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, I had heard you recently at PLC, the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, and you were on a panel about energy.
Right.
And it struck me, we're neighbors on the House floor,
right,
but sometimes we don't always talk in depth about issues.
Right.
And I heard you talk about energy, and it struck me that you're quite versed. I think you're in tune with your district, which is an energy-rich district. So my first question here is, why is energy policy especially critical in a state like Pennsylvania?
Well, first of all, Pennsylvania is one of the largest energy exporters in the country, not necessarily the world as well. So, energy is a big economic driver for our state. And so anytime you're talking energy policy, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about impacts to the local community. And it specifically hits home for me because I have one of the largest coal-fired electric generation plants in the nation in Homer City, as well as others in my district.
Yeah, and we just had a policy hearing on liquefied natural gas, which is something that not only should we as Pennsylvania be shipping it to neighboring states like
Absolutely.
New York, other consumers, but overseas as well.
Yeah.
But there's the coal element too. I have a Brunner Island in my district,
Mm-hmm.
which is right on the river. It's a natural gas to steam electric plant, but they have coal still in reserve.
Right.
And that comes into play sometimes in the winter. Sometimes it's actually appropriate to switch over to coal. I believe you had told a story at PLC about a coal-fired plant that maybe saved the grid in your area. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to understand, the push for renewables is fine until you get to that point where they're not working. And that typically happens in the middle of winter or in the hottest days of summer when you need that base load energy. And that comes from coal, natural gas, and nuclear. What happened during Winter Storm Elliott 2 Christmases ago when the temperatures were, below zero on Christmas Eve, nothing could get it done. Natural gas wasn't getting it done. There was nothing from solar or wind. And they relied on the coal-fired electric generation plants in my district to power the grid on the East Coast. Without that base load availability of coal, we would not have had Christmas. You wouldn't have had Christmas lights, you wouldn't have had heat, and you wouldn't have had Christmas Day.
Yeah, so fossil fuel advocates like you and I, you can't, and from our Republican caucus, we're for all of the above.
Absolutely.
So I'm not against solar or wind or any of those other options. Would you say that you agree? Are you for all of the above?
I am, certainly. I've even co-sponsored some solar bills. I think we have to take a realistic approach, though. You can't solely rely on solar and wind if you think that's going to power the grid, because it will not. You need all of these sources of energy during different times of the year. As I said, I think it's great. Solar is great, but it's not enough to power the entire grid. I think I said during that conference, to replace the Homer City generating station, which did close last year, much to my chagrin, and that's because of RGGI and extreme federal policies as well. It would take 10 million solar panels to replace the energy loss from the Homer City generating station. 704 windmills. Think of the environmental impacts that would create, just in the amount of land mass needed to create that energy. And again, it's not sustainable, it's not reliable. So just to replace one power plant, you would need all of that infrastructure, and then it has to be tapped into the grid. So there are just so many different levels on which you cannot rely on renewables.
And we heard a similar story about the proposed Renovo plant.
Right.
Renovo's around State College, more or less. And those plans were eventually, after, I think, litigation and just activism on the environmental side, they decided to close up shop and go elsewhere, which is exactly what we don't want to happen here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, a $1.5 billion investment, I believe it was, proposed before Governor Wolf went down the Reggie path. But that plant was still moving forward until the activists got involved. And basically the company, Bechtel, said, you know what, we don't need this hassle. We're going to go to another state where we are welcome. And we've seen that happen across the board over the past 5 years.
Yeah, and I don't blame those companies. I want to be welcome in a state to do business.
Absolutely.
So let's talk Reggie. There's, Governor Wolf submitted this proposal to unilaterally enroll us into Reggie. We know what Reggie is. It's a compact that has pretty radical measures. In fact, it translates to a tax on energy. Reggie would equate to about a 30% increase on electricity bills. And Shapiro has unveiled his non-Reggie plan.
Right,
He's billing it as it's not quite Reggie, but it's pretty much exactly the same.
Right.
How would this negatively affect, if we enroll in this kind of a program, how would this negatively affect the price of energy, the loss of jobs, et cetera?
It's the same exact thing. He's just calling it a different clever acronym. But it's Reggie rolled up into only a Pennsylvania program now. So what that's going to do, I believe Ohio and West Virginia are licking their chops because they're saying, yeah, go down that path, Governor Shapiro, because we've already seen billions of dollars in investment come to Ohio and West Virginia because Pennsylvania went down the Reggie path. I mentioned $14 billion in new infrastructure, energy infrastructure, was invested in Pennsylvania prior to Governor Wolf announcing the Reggie proposal. Not a dime has been spent in Pennsylvania since then. So it's already going to other states. And I thought that Governor Shapiro on the campaign trail, he said, well, I think Reggie might be bad for Pennsylvania and that maybe we shouldn't do this. And then he turns around and rolls out this plan, which makes zero sense because, again, it's going to do the same thing. Now, he claims it's going to create all these jobs and save consumers money on their electric bills, but it's not. No. It's simply going to curtail energy production. It's going to put a tax on manufacturers as well, anyone who emits CO2.
Manufacturers who could also relocate their business.
And they most likely will. And you couple that with every other anti-business policy we have in Pennsylvania, the slow permitting process, everything else, all the red tape, and then these extreme environmental regulations that really aren't even necessary because they will do nothing to change climate, temperatures across this planet.
Yeah.
And all it will really do is hurt Pennsylvania residents and consumers. And think about it. If you're an energy company and this governor is proposing this, and he's saying, well, we'll give a rebate to the consumers, but the companies are still going to pay the tax. Why would you want to locate in Pennsylvania? Why would you want to stay here when there are other states that, rolling out the red carpet for energy production?
So according to polls, Jim, inflation is still at the top of everybody's list.
Absolutely.
I believe I heard a stat recently that 60% of Pennsylvanians are living paycheck to paycheck. This is kind of a rhetorical question, but 30% tax on electricity. Of course, like you mentioned, these manufacturers and these other outfits are passing these increases down to consumers. Yeah. So what does that mean to somebody who's already living paycheck to paycheck?
Well, it should really concern every Pennsylvania resident because you're not going to see your energy costs go down. And energy is involved in everything from delivering products and services to markets, to consumers, to creating products, to manufacturing, to keeping your hospitals open, keeping your schools open. Everybody pays electrical costs or energy costs. So by adding an additional tax to the creators of that electricity, it's going to be funneled down to the consumer. And that means your cost, your everyday cost, the money that you have, the minimal amount you have to put food on the table for your family and pay your bills, isn't going to be stretching as far. Yep. That means that everybody's costs are going to go up. And we're going to lose more jobs, which again affects our tax base. It simply makes zero sense for a state like Pennsylvania to even consider something as foolhardy as Reggie or this governor's new project.
Yeah, and energy, as you just described, is the central issue in our state. And it should be a unifying issue.
Right.
And in fact, it's been as divisive as you can imagine. And it's our hope, obviously, in the Republican caucus that we can have some sense on the other side of the aisle on this issue. Jim, lightning round here.
Yep.
You and a couple of your Republican colleagues have introduced legislation around combating this Reggie-like measure. If there's any measure that goes into place on energy policy, your bill would enact this process that would measure how that would affect energy price, cost. Can you go into a little bit more detail on those measures?
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you. I've always been about leading as far as just kick someone else's plan around. You have to have your own plan in place, and that's what we're doing. We're saying enough with the Department of Environmental Protection dictating our energy policy, because that's what it's come down to. You know, the environmental controls are saying how we produce energy, which makes zero sense to me. So my proposal is to create an actual Department of Energy that regulates energy production, you know, in conjunction with environmental concerns and controls. But let's focus on creating energy, creating those jobs, growing our economy based around our energy industry, which is one of the largest in the country. That makes sense. Instead of letting the environmental policy crush our energy production, let's look at it from a different perspective. And that, to me, is what we need to do. We need to capitalize on the energy that we have, on the jobs that we have, grow those industries, while also, you know, adhering to environmental policies. But let's keep these environmental policies in check, because they are a little out of control right now.
Yep, agreed. He's Representative Jim Struzzi. He represents the 62nd District in Indiana County. Jim, thanks for joining.
Absolutely, Joe. Thanks for having me.
This has been Straight to the Point. Visit repjod.com/mypodcasts.